Hi, welcome to Swing State News. My name is Lucas Whitty, political researcher of the Battleground states. Today we are discussing the U.S. Senate spots that are up for grabs in the 2026 midterm election cycle. Currently, out of the 7 swing states, there are 3 seats in the U.S. Senate that will be voted upon this November. Let's take a look at the candidates and which way it may be swinging. In the 2026 midterms, we are voting on Class 2 senators for the U.S. Senate. There are 100 senators in the Senate. Typically, a Class 2 year means Americans will vote for 33 Senate seats. This year, we are voting on 35 due to special elections from Florida, Marco Rubio becoming the Secretary of State, and Ohio, J.D. Vance becoming the 50th U.S. Vice President. Currently, Republican John Husted fills Vice President Vance's seat, and Republican Ashley Moody has filled Marco Rubio's seat. Both of these seats are from the 3rd class of senators, but because they are appointed by the governors of those states, they have to go through a special election in order to fill the 6-year term completely. Both of these senators are running and seeking to fill the rest of the term. Not necessarily swing state news, but news nonetheless, because it is notable that we will be having a heavy U.S. Senate voting year. Clearly, both of these states are Republican-leaning, especially Florida. But Ohio is looking to be a tighter race as recent polls are showing within 10 points, and the governor race between Vivek and Acton are right around a 1-point difference. Now, let's get into the swing states' U.S. Senate seats. The current battleground states that will be voting for a U.S. Senator this year are Michigan, Georgia, and North Carolina. Starting off with Michigan, we have an open seat due to Senator Gary Peters announcing that he is not seeking re-election. He has represented the state of Michigan in the U.S. Senate since 2015, serving just 2 terms. He is now going to focus on other things in a private manner and never looked at being a politician as a lifelong career. So, who is running for this seat and how close will the race be? Currently, there are 4 Democrats and 5 Republican candidates who have filed and declared their run for U.S. Senate. On the Democrat side, we have Abdul El-Sayed, Rachel Howard, Mallory McMorrow, and Haley Stevens. On the Republican side, we have Kent Benham, Fred Herdebees, Mike Rogers, Genevieve Scott, and Bernadette Smith. Currently, Democrats have raised over $17 million between the 4 candidates, according to the Federal Election Committee, also known as the FEC, which all candidates are supposed to report all of their campaign fundings to. Abdul El-Sayed has raised over $5.3 million, Rachel Howard has raised just over $10,000, State Senator Mallory McMorrow raised almost $5.6 million, and current U.S. Congresswoman Haley Stevens has raised over $6.8 million. Republicans have nearly raised $5.5 million over the 5 candidates. Most of that money raised is from Mike Rogers, who has raised over $5.3 million. Genevieve Scott has raised $58,000. Bernadette Smith raised almost $15,000 currently, and Fred Herdebees has raised just over $10,000 with no information on Kent Benham currently. Polling for the Democrat Party is favoring current Congresswoman Haley Stevens, with State Senator Mallory McMorrow following closely behind, and some polls show her favored. Overall, the race between the Democrat primary is pretty close between Congresswoman Stevens, State Senator McMorrow, and Abdul El-Sayed. Polling for the Republican Party is favoring Mike Rogers heavily. After all, he just ran for U.S. Senator in 2024 against Democrat Alyssa Slotkin, and just barely lost by less than 1 point. Overall, the polling data is showing that Democrat Haley Stevens has a competitive edge over Republican Mike Rogers, but it is still way too close to call who will be representing the state of Michigan in the U.S. Senate. Michigan split the ticket in 2024, voting for Donald Trump as president, but voted for a Democrat senator. Michigan has not been represented by a Republican in the U.S. Senate since 2000. On to Georgia. Currently, Democrat Senator Jon Ossoff is running for re-election in the 2026 midterm. So far, that is the only Democrat that I can talk about in depth today. There is another challenger named Kia Leggett, but I have not found any information that is included in today's topics, as she recently filed in December. On the Republican side, there are 3 candidates that have declared they are running for U.S. Senate, with 8 filed. Out of the 3 candidates, we have U.S. Representatives Buddy Carter and Mike Collins. Also, we have former Tennessee Volunteers head football coach Derek Dooley running for U.S. Senator. Currently, Senator Ossoff has raised nearly $64 million. Senator Ossoff has really shown he is the king of fundraising. In his last race for senator, he raised over $100 million, the most in the U.S. Senate history. Republicans have raised around $12.5 million amongst the three candidates. Congressman Buddy Carter has raised over $6.2 million. Congressman Mike Collins has raised over $3.2 million, and Derek Dooley has raised just over $3 million. Currently, the polling on the Democrat side has simply just been incumbent Senator Jon Ossoff. He will most likely win the primary with nearly 100% of the vote. On the Republican side of things, Representative Mike Collins is favorable so far, with Buddy Carter following and Derek Dooley behind him. I want to note that this early polling is really hard to gauge, and most of the polling is heavily undecided in all of these Senate races that we are looking at, meaning the highest percentages in these polling groups are undecided and not candidate heavy yet. This race is close and still considered a toss-up, but it does lean more on the Democrat side by a slim margin. Jon Ossoff barely won his seat in 2020, defeating incumbent Republican David Perdue. None of the candidates won the majority in November of 2020, so a runoff election was held in January of 2021, where Senator Jon Ossoff won by just over 1 point. I want to note here that less people voted in the runoff compared to the general election, where in the photos you can see the incumbent Senator David Perdue had 2.4 million votes in November, and the winner of the election, Jon Ossoff, only had 2.26 million votes in January and won. So, if the same amount of people voted in the last election, this could easily have been represented differently. I'm not telling you whether that is a good or a bad thing, just pointing out that this is a super tight race and this U.S. Senate spot is the highest contested and highest funded race in the nation. On to North Carolina. Another open seat here, as we mentioned in our last video, that Senator Thom Tillis is not seeking re-election. Just like Senator Gary Peters from Michigan, Senator Tillis has been representing his state of North Carolina since 2015 and announced earlier this year that he is stepping down. So, who is running for this seat and how close will it be? Currently, there are 6 Republicans running and 6 Democrats running for the primary, which is being held today, March 3rd. On the Republican side, we have Don Brown, Richard Danzey, Thomas Johnson, Michelle Morrow, Elizabeth Temple, and Michael Whatley. On the Democrat side, we have Robert Colin, Roy Cooper, Justin Dews, Darrell Farrow, Orrick Quick, and Marcus Williams. Republicans have raised nearly $6.5 million over 5 of the 6 candidates, most of it coming from Michael Whatley, who is former chair of the RNC. He has raised over $6.2 million. Don Brown has raised over $187,000, Michelle Morrow over $10,000, with Richard Danzey and Thomas Johnson under $10,000 each. Democrats have raised over $21 million over 2 of the 6 candidates, which nearly all of that money raised by previous Governor Roy Cooper. He has raised just over $21 million, and Marcus Williams has raised less than $3,000. I want to note that I'm not neglecting the other candidates here. There is just no information from what I found on the FEC that candidates are supposed to report their earnings to. That tells me how much money they have fundraised for their campaign. That doesn't make the other candidates less viable than the others. Polls show that Michael Whatley will most likely be the Republican candidate for this midterm, and Roy Cooper will most likely be the Democrat candidate. Overall, the polls are showing that this seat is looking to flip from Republican senator to Democrat senator so far. There is still a lot of time for that to change between here and November. It will be interesting to see the results at the end of the day, such later this week. Encompassing all of this together, between the 7 states, there are 3 U.S. senators being voted upon this midterm election. Out of the 3, 2 of them are currently Democrats and 1 is Republican. There are 2 open seats and 1 incumbent running for re-election. So far, polls are showing that Democrats will remain in their seats and gain 1. Currently, the Senate is a Republican majority with 53 Republicans, 45 Democrats, and 2 independents that mostly vote with Democrats. So, amongst the swing states, only 1 seat could be gained by Democrats this midterm. Republicans would still hold the majority. However, like we covered a little earlier in this video, Ohio is currently a Republican senator, and that is looking to be a tight race as well. Also, Maine is Republican held, and Democrats seem to be targeting this seat as well. Maine has been known to have tight elections too, so it will be worth paying attention to in the upcoming months. With the swing states being toss-ups, you never know what could happen. Republicans could extend the majority, or Democrats could split the Senate in half if they were to win NC, Maine, and Ohio. Wrapping up, I want to take some time and call out voter turnout. Michigan's population is just over 10 million people, In 2024, 5.66 million people voted for president. Just over half of the population in Michigan voted for POTUS. 5.57 million Michiganders voted for U.S. Senator on the same ticket. That means nearly 100,000 people went in, voted for POTUS, and not U.S. Senator. In Georgia, there's nearly 11 million people. In 2024, 5.25 million Georgians voted for president, less than half of the state's population. Similarly to Michigan, even fewer people voted for U.S. Senator in the state. I will call out Georgia in this, though. With voter turnout being so bad, having runoffs seems stupid to me. Forcing people to vote a certain way, typically the two-party system, is just lunacy and promotes poor voter turnout. In North Carolina, there are just over 11 million people in the Tar Heel state, and the election results page showed there were 7.7 million ballots and only 5.7 million people cast them. Less than 6 million people voted for the president, and in the most recent vote for senator in 2022, less than 4 million people voted in that election. All that being said, get out and vote for who you want to represent you in the U.S. Senate this year, as midterms are just as important as presidential elections. Thank you for watching, and if you found this information helpful or informative, please like and subscribe.